The government paid me $20,000 to go through something terrifying. It began with a voicemail I never should have listened to. A monotone voice. Female. Not robotic, but trained. Clinical in the way only someone who'd read enough government scripts could sound. It simply said, "Your profile meets our operational criteria. We are offering you $20,000 for participation in a classified observational protocol. Transportation and compensation will be arranged. Reply to this number within 48 hours or the invitation will be void." No name. No agency. No hint of what they wanted. Just that. 20 grand. Up front. And an opportunity I didn't remember applying for. I deleted it at first, half suspecting a scam or some black hat operation fishing for desperate people. But that night I kept thinking about it. I was 3 months behind on rent, my car had been impounded after a snowstorm because I hadn't renewed the plates, and my refrigerator buzzed louder than it cooled. I had 2 weeks of canned beans, expired oatmeal, and a bank account that mocked me every time I opened the app. I told myself it was probably illegal, probably shady, but I still replayed that voicemail in my head so many times I could hear the precise pause between classified and observational. That pause wasn't a mistake. It was a test. The next morning I called the number. There was no ringtone, just immediate silence, followed by a different voice, male, this time, and not quite American. Eastern European, maybe. He confirmed my name, which I never gave. Confirmed my last 4 digits of social. Then gave me a departure time. You will be picked up in front of your apartment building at 0430 hours Thursday morning. Pack 3 days' worth of clothing. Leave electronics behind. No phones, no watches. No devices of any kind. No contact with family or friends. You will be compensated upon completion. There will be no further communication until retrieval. I asked what it was for. The line went dead. I slept like a prisoner the night before a transfer, only because I had no energy to think. There was a gravity to this thing I didn't understand, but it had me in orbit. And Thursday morning, right on time, a black Lincoln with plates too clean to be real pulled up in front of my apartment. The driver didn't speak. He wore a blue windbreaker with no markings and sunglasses even though it was dark out. When I asked him if this was the pickup for the contract work, he nodded once. No more. I got in. The drive was long. 4 hours, maybe 5, with no landmarks I could recognize. We avoided major highways, took back roads and detours that wound through industrial parks, forests, abandoned airfields. At some point, I realized the car was heading west, then northwest. I tried to track the sun, but the windows were tinted so heavily that I couldn't be sure of the direction. Eventually, we passed through a checkpoint manned by 2 soldiers in desert camo, with no flags or insignia. They waved us through. The barrier lifted, and suddenly we were in a compound, hidden behind what looked like a lumber distribution yard. Stacks of logs and sheeted crates lined the outside, but once we were inside the inner gate, the landscape changed. It wasn't just concrete and barbed wire. It was sterile, too clean. Like the place was built for one thing only: to isolate. I was taken into a building with no windows. The hallways smelled like copper and ammonia, and the fluorescent lights buzzed a fraction out of sync with my own heartbeat, which I could now feel in my teeth. They took my clothes, issued me a gray jumpsuit. No name tag, no pockets. Just a number printed faintly along the inner collar, 11C073. They gave me 2 meals per day in a sealed tray and escorted me to a windowless dormitory. 8 bunks, no mirrors, 1 shared bathroom with faucets that delivered lukewarm water at best. Nobody spoke unless prompted. The other participants, if that's what we were, all shared a similar look, dazed, cautious, eyes fixed somewhere else. It wasn't fear exactly. It was suspension. Like we were all still falling from something we hadn't seen the edge of. Orientation was scheduled exactly 24 hours after arrival. We were led into a briefing room, where 3 officials stood behind a one-way glass window. A voice came through a speaker embedded in the ceiling. You are here as part of a controlled observational protocol. The parameters of the experience cannot be disclosed prior to completion. All responses will be documented. Any deviation from the rules will result in immediate forfeiture of compensation. You are not permitted to communicate details of your experience to others. You are not permitted to touch, speak to, or otherwise interact with what you encounter. Compliance ensures your safety. Non-compliance terminates the agreement. They gave us papers to sign. 4 pages, most of it redacted. A line about waiving liability for psychological trauma. A clause absolving them from harm resulting from exposure to externalized phenomena. Another section about temporal dissonance, which I assumed was a misprint, until I noticed 3 others pause on that same paragraph. No one asked questions. We were told we could withdraw at that point and leave with a partial compensation of $500. Nobody moved, not even me. They called us in one at a time for psychological testing. Standard questions at first. Do you hear voices? Have you ever experienced blackouts, etc.? Then stranger ones. If you encountered a version of yourself that claimed to be you, how would you verify your identity? Do you believe memories can be false even if they feel real? Have you ever felt watched in a place where you were alone? They scanned my pupils while I answered. Measured galvanic response, heart rate, vocal cadence. I was told nothing of my results. That evening, I lay in my bunk staring at the ceiling, which had no light fixtures. Just an even glow that came from somewhere not visible. No shadows, no edges, just the sensation of exposure from every angle, like being studied by 1,000 eyes wearing white gloves. When I closed my eyes, I saw flashes, not dreams, just shapes. Intermittent flickers of something behind a wall that didn't exist yet. My name felt unfamiliar in my mouth when I repeated it silently, trying to reassure myself I still remembered it. There were no clocks, no routine. Time felt suspended. We could have been there for 2 days or 6. Eventually, one of the guards came for me. He knocked on the doorframe, didn't say a word, then pointed. I followed him. They called it Session 1. No explanation. Just that. A metal corridor with no seams, soundproof doors, one chair in the middle of a dimly lit room. A helmet-shaped device that descended from the ceiling like it had been waiting. They motioned for me to sit. I did. No one strapped me in. The device lowered and hovered inches from my skull. Then there was nothing but static. And then, something else. There is a kind of silence that isn't just the absence of sound, but the vacuum left behind after something vital has been taken. That's what I felt the moment the helmet descended, surrounding my head with weightless hums and static electricity that didn't crackle but vibrated just below the range of human hearing, like the aftershock of a signal meant for someone else. For a moment, I thought I had lost consciousness, though I never felt the falling. There was no transition from sitting in that cold metal chair to where I was next. Just a cold flicker, like a faulty frame in a film reel. And then the scene had changed. I was standing barefoot in what looked like a subterranean tunnel, made of wet stone and metal ribs that pulsed faintly with heat. No guards, no doors, just me. And overhead, the curved ceiling stretched too high, with no visible origin for the dim amber light that bled along the walls like the inside of a dying furnace. My clothes were still the same, the jumpsuit with the faded number at the collar, but the floor beneath me was damp and alive with vibration, like something enormous had just passed beneath my feet and was still resonating through the ground. I moved forward instinctively, not because I had direction, but because the idea of standing still felt wrong, like the tunnel might grow around me, close in, or reabsorb me into the stone if I hesitated too long. Every few feet there were outcroppings along the wall, boxes or panels or perhaps instruments, though none had labels, switches, or screens. Just embossed grooves and unreadable symbols that seemed too deliberate to be decorative. At one point I passed a section of wall that was slightly ajar, like a panel pushed open by something that had fled or escaped. Inside it was dark, but the smell, copper and something sweetly rotten, lingered with a heat that didn't match the rest of the air. I kept walking. No footsteps. The floor didn't echo, didn't respond, and after a few hundred feet, maybe more, the tunnel widened. This new chamber was circular, domed like a cathedral, but the center had a pit, perfectly round, rimmed with blackened stone and filled with a slow-churning liquid that wasn't quite water. It was thicker, more reflective. It didn't ripple, but it moved with a rhythm that felt wrong, as if something massive was breathing beneath the surface. There were no guards, no officials, no voice from a speaker telling me where to go or what I was seeing. Only this impossible place that hummed with buried machinery and walls that seemed to sweat. I looked for a camera. Some part of me assumed they must be watching, cataloging my every reaction. But the room had no visible tech, no microphones, no lenses, no exit. Just the same impossible silence that wasn't really silent. I don't know how long I stood there. Eventually, I reached out to touch the edge of the pit, not because I wanted to disobey, but because I needed to feel something real. The stone was warm, and under my palm, it throbbed once, faintly, like the skin of a living thing. I recoiled without realizing I had moved and stumbled backward, heart thudding in my throat, as the room's light deepened to an almost bruise-colored hue. And then, without warning, a sound came, not from around me, but from within. A tone, low, harmonic, resonating in the cavities behind my eyes, as if the frequency had bypassed my ears and gone straight into the skull. I dropped to one knee, not from pain, but from confusion. My thoughts weren't entirely mine anymore. Images began to flash, not like memories, but like something being fed through my mind as though I were a conduit. A mountain, a ship without sails, hovering over a black ocean, a silhouette without a face, standing beneath a sky torn open like fabric. I saw a door buried in the side of a desert, pulsating with light that wanted out. I saw a man split down the middle but still breathing, his two halves kept alive by cables and black wires that moved on their own. And through it all, I heard that same tone, constant and unshifting like a beacon aimed at something far beneath where humans should be. Then the images stopped. No fade, no warning. Just gone. The silence returned with such weight that it felt louder than the sound. And the next thing I remember is the door, the one I hadn't seen before, opening. It didn't make a sound. It simply existed now, where the wall had once been unbroken. White light spilled in, too clean to be natural. I got up, knees aching, vision pulsing with phantom shapes that lingered like afterimages from a welding torch. I stepped through. The corridor on the other side was different from the first. This one was narrow, built like a medical wing with sterile white panels and lights that flickered at perfect intervals. There were doors on either side, each labeled with numbers and letters I didn't understand. Not English. Not any language I could place. But when I paused in front of one, the label rearranged itself into something I could read. My name. My full name. Middle included. And a birth date that wasn't mine but was close enough to make my skin crawl. I tried to open it. It didn't move. Another voice, this time real, not in my head, came from behind me. "You're early." I turned. A man in a black coat, thin-rimmed glasses, clipboard held casually under one arm. His ID badge was blank. No photo. Just a barcode and a symbol I couldn't identify. A circle with a single line running through it vertically. He didn't offer his name. Just looked at me like I was a patient he hadn't expected yet. "You weren't supposed to advance until session 3, he said, tilting his head slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "Interesting. Follow me, please." We moved quickly. The hallway twisted in impossible geometry. Sharp corners that didn't match the building's exterior. Descending ramps that curved sideways instead of down. The man didn't speak again until we reached a door marked only by a blue light. He waved his badge across an invisible scanner. The door hissed open. Inside, a small white room with 2 chairs and a table. No surveillance visible. But I knew better now. The man gestured for me to sit. "Do you know where you are?" he asked. I shook my head. "Do you know why you were chosen?" I said no. He paused, then placed a small black device on the table. Oval, smooth and pulsing with a red heartbeat glow. "You saw something in the chamber, yes?" I nodded. "You weren't supposed to, not yet. But that's instructive." He leaned back in the chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "We used to think location was everything. That certain places in the world held resonance points, weak spots, but we were wrong. It's not about the geography, it's about the people. Some of you can receive the signal sooner. Some of you are tuned already, without knowing. You're what we call cognitives, a rare group, and now we know you're one of them." I opened my mouth to ask what that meant, but he raised a finger. "No questions yet. We're adjusting your protocol. You'll receive compensation for the original task, but you're being reassigned. The next phase begins tomorrow. Until then, you'll rest. Eat. Do not speak to the others." He stood. The door opened again. And just like that, I was alone. Sleep didn't come easily, not because the bed in my new quarters was uncomfortable. On the contrary, it was clinically perfect, neither soft nor hard. wrapped in some fabric that neither crinkled nor warmed. But because my thoughts had been dislodged from their natural rhythm, I kept feeling the weight of what I'd seen in that chamber, the strange black liquid that had moved like a breath beneath the earth, and that tone, still faintly echoing in my skull, like a memory humming inside bone. There was no window, of course. The walls were pristine white, smooth and rounded at the corners, without seams or shadows. The ceiling gave off a dim, ambient light that never changed, as if the passage of time had no permission to exist here. I had no watch, and no clock was provided. I was left with only my thoughts to mark the crawl of hours that never truly revealed themselves. Breakfast arrived without a sound. I woke to a tray on the small shelf next to the door. Sealed plastic compartments, perfectly balanced nutrition, no scent. Everything in this place seemed to operate without human presence. I hadn't seen a single guard. No staff apart from the man with the clipboard. It felt less like I had been imprisoned, and more like I had been archived, filed away into a quiet little pocket of something bigger than I was ever meant to witness. I ate because not eating felt like giving them control. The food had no flavor, yet left no aftertaste. The texture was soft, neither wet nor dry. Something designed to fulfill a function and nothing else. Like I was a machine to be fueled. After the meal, the wall beside the shelf hissed open without prompt, revealing a corridor bathed in pale blue. This one was narrower, the floor padded with a material that silenced every step, and there were no markings, no arrows, no names, no labels. I followed it without hesitation. I think a part of me had accepted that agency here was an illusion. We were led whether we resisted or not, and obedience was just a polite form of gravity. The corridor led me into a new room, unlike the others. This one had glass walls on two sides, and a long observation pane on the third, where shadows moved behind the smoked transparency. A metal chair was bolted to the floor in the center, beneath a ring of lights that pulsed with faint green intervals, like a metronome set to the tempo of a heartbeat slowed by sedation. I sat because I knew that not sitting would only delay the inevitable. The lights brightened in response. From the pane behind the glass came a voice. Not the man from before, but another, colder, female, with no regional accent I could detect. We're going to show you a series of images. Do not try to interpret them. Do not try to describe them. Simply let them pass through you. Think of them like waves. Your mind is the water. I didn't respond. The lights above my head dimmed to black. Then the first image arrived. Not on a screen. No screen existed. It came directly into my vision, as if I had blinked and opened my eyes inside a new world. At first, they were simple. Shapes, geometric spirals, impossible angles, recursive fractals that twisted inward toward infinity. Then came symbols, some resembling language, others abstract glyphs that shimmered and slid across my mental field of view. Then the faces began. But they weren't human. They bore the rough symmetry of sentient beings. But their proportions were all wrong. Some were long and flat, others tall and narrow, their eyes fixed in patterns that made no evolutionary sense. Triangles, rows, radial clusters. Not grotesque, but profoundly wrong. As if designed by a god who had read about humans in a book, but never seen one. I wanted to blink, to look away. But I had no control. My eyes remained open, though I no longer felt their weight. And the images continued. Then came the voices. Not from outside, but within the same corridor of perception where the images floated. They weren't in English, or any language I knew, but I understood them. Not the words, but the intent. They were not speaking to me. They were speaking through me, testing the resonance of my mind as one might test the harmonics of a bell. Each sound seemed to peel something back in my memory, revealing layers I didn't know existed. Childhood dreams returned, ones I had forgotten, moments from school, fleeting glances, the scent of my mother's coat after rain. But these memories had been restructured, twisted, as if passed through a foreign filter. My mother's coat wasn't blue anymore. It was black. The rain smelled like rust. I don't know how long it lasted. When it ended, the lights returned slowly, and the room felt colder, though the temperature had not changed. The door behind me opened, and a man I had not seen before stepped in. He wore the same kind of coat as the clipboard man, but he was older, his face drawn and pale, with eyes that didn't seem interested in me at all. "You're a receiver," he said simply. "One of 38 so far. Only 7 have made it to Phase 3. He looked past me as he spoke, as if addressing the room rather than me. Your signal integrity is high. You resisted distortion. That's rare. He tapped a finger against the glass, then gestured for me to stand. You're going to meet the others. It's important that you don't touch them. No physical contact under any circumstances. The word, others, caught something in my chest. Up until now, I hadn't even considered the possibility of more like me. I had felt alone from the moment I accepted the assignment. The idea that there were more, 37 others, was somehow both comforting and terrifying. He led me down a new corridor. This one different. There were windows along the left wall, small, square, and recessed deeply into the structure. Behind each was a room, and inside each room was a person. Some sat, some stood, some lay on the floor, their eyes wide open, not blinking. Men and women, all different ages, races, backgrounds, and all of them looked like they had seen something that had permanently disconnected them from the ordinary world. One woman, pale-skinned and wearing a jumpsuit stained at the wrists, mouthed something over and over again. I couldn't hear her, but I could read her lips. It's not the moon. It's not the moon. It's not the moon. The man noticed my stare. She received a false positive. Some minds create feedback loops. They echo instead of absorb, like a mirror catching sunlight until it burns itself. He tapped a code on a panel at the end of the hallway, and a new door opened. Inside was a circular room with 8 chairs arranged in a loose ring, each one facing the others. 7 were occupied. I recognized none of the faces, but all of them turned toward me with the same strange look. Not curiosity, not fear, but something like recognition, as if they had already seen me somewhere far before this. A woman with dark hair and an angular jaw nodded. He's stable, she said softly. Another man, bald, with red scars along his temple, added, high fidelity. No warping. He'll hold. I sat without being told. In the center of the circle, a metallic pedestal rose from the floor, flat and empty. The lights above us dimmed again, and the woman spoke. We are the cognitives. We are the voice between the static, and they've brought you here because you heard it too. My mouth was dry, my throat thick with unspoken questions, but I stayed silent. I knew the next phase had begun. There is a silence that occurs not when there is no sound, but when the sounds you hear no longer belong to your world. A kind of void within recognition, where you become aware that your senses are processing something, but that something is outside of any frame of reference you've ever possessed. That's what it felt like inside the cognitive's chamber. The hum of the room wasn't mechanical nor electric, but something deeper, something intrinsic, as though the walls themselves were emitting a frequency tuned to the contours of the human nervous system. No one spoke for several minutes after I sat. The lights above remained dim, but not in a way that created darkness, just a gentle flattening of contrast, like the edges of the world had been softly erased. The pedestal in the center continued to pulse with a pale internal glow, rhythmic even. It reminded me of the sonar pings I used to hear back in the Navy days. Reliable, reassuring, until they returned an echo that wasn't supposed to exist. The bald man who had spoken earlier leaned forward slightly. His eyes were pale and glassy, but I could feel them moving inside his skull, measuring me. Residuals, he said, as though continuing a thought I hadn't heard. They begin after the first contact session, usually in sleep, sometimes in mirrors, rarely in water. The woman with the dark hair spoke next, her voice soft and deliberate. You may feel them as déjà vu, as phantom smells or as reverse emotion. Joy during pain, grief during peace. They're distortions left behind by translation. She tilted her head, eyes unfocused, like the scuff marks from dragging an idea through a human brain. None of them seemed interested in reassuring me. No one here believed in comfort anymore. That had died somewhere between Phase 1 and whatever this place was. Another woman, young, blonde, her hands trembling slightly as they rested on her knees, added, You'll know the first residual by its taste. It never matches the air around you. I didn't know what she meant, not yet, but I would. They didn't bother to ask about my background, or my training, or even why I accepted the offer. Those details had become irrelevant. We were past personal history now. Whatever I had been before, the man with debts, The naval officer with a quiet discharge, the man who once loved someone he barely remembered now, those roles were all obsolete. The government hadn't hired us to be who we were. They had hired us to become something else entirely. The cognitives didn't sleep in normal quarters. After the session, I was escorted not back to my former white room but to a lower level, through a corridor that curved downward in impossible geometry. I swear, at one point, we walked a straight line while my inner ear screamed that we were spiraling. The room they gave me had no bed. Just a padded floor, a recessed sink, and a narrow slit of dark glass embedded into the wall, which I suspected was a one-way viewport. The air smelled different here. Slightly metallic, like the aftermath of a lightning strike. I felt watched, but never by cameras, only by something I couldn't describe. Like an awareness lingering just outside the sensory veil. Something that didn't blink. Sleep came eventually, though I don't remember falling into it. I remember sitting down, leaning back against the wall, and then waking up gasping. My chest was tight, my skin wet with cold sweat. The dream had been vivid, more real than the room I awoke to. In it, I stood in a corridor of the station, but everything had been reversed. The lights were below my feet, pulsing from the floor like a river of veins. The walls were smooth and moist, breathing slowly, and at the far end, someone stood, unmoving, watching me. Not a person, at least, not anymore. A shape in human outline, but shifting, like the static from an old television screen trying to resolve a face it never learned. And the worst part, it knew my name. It didn't speak it. I just knew that it knew. A fact burned into the center of my spine. I barely had time to catch my breath before the slit in the wall opened, revealing the older man from my first assessment, the one with eyes that never quite looked at me directly. He nodded once and said, "You're ready for the chamber." I asked no questions. Questions in this place seemed either dangerous or irrelevant. I followed him through another silent passage, past more of those featureless doors, until we arrived at a checkpoint manned not by soldiers, but by terminals, machines that scanned us with light, not touch. A door sealed behind me with a hiss, and the floor shifted slightly beneath my feet as we descended again. Always downward. This entire facility was like a vein boring into the earth, away from light, from context, from jurisdiction. The chamber was not like the others. This one was enormous, circular, domed, with walls of a strange alloy that seemed to dull all echoes. In the center was a pit, a perfect circle of darkness, surrounded by railings and panels lit with symbols I did not understand. The cognitives stood around it, spaced evenly like markers on a clock face. No one spoke. The man gestured for me to stand before the pit. "Residual calibration," he said. "Open your mouth." I hesitated, but only for a second. A hiss of air sprayed against my face, and then something metallic was pressed to my tongue. Bitter, cold, and humming softly. I gagged as it dissolved instantly, sending a burning sensation down the back of my throat. And then the noise returned. That same deep infrasonic tone I'd felt during the first chamber, but now it was inside me, vibrating through my ribcage, distorting my thoughts, as if my memories were being shuffled like pages in a windstorm. I dropped to my knees. One of the cognitives placed something at my temple. I heard a click, felt a spark, and then silence. A silence so complete that even my thoughts became whispers. And in that silence, I saw the residual. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a vision. It was something older than both. A memory that didn't belong to me. I was in a field, dead grass beneath my feet. A moon above me, enormous and far too close, pulsing gently like a heart. I turned, and there was a structure behind me. Tall, impossibly tall, reaching upward in increments that bent space. Its surface was reflective, but it showed me not myself, but a younger version of someone else. The face was familiar, though I had never seen it. And behind that reflection in the sky, something moved. Not a ship, not a bird. A concept, folding and unfolding itself like thought made flesh. And in that moment, I understood. The residuals were not side effects. They were keys. Fragments of a consciousness trying to anchor itself inside human minds. And we were being prepared to receive it. When I awoke, I was no longer in the chamber. I was in my room again, this time with new markings on the wall. Symbols like those from the first session, etched into the surface by something hot and precise. My throat still burned. My skin ached. And in the back of my mind, the noise had changed. It wasn't a tone anymore. It was a voice. Still distant. Still half-formed. But speaking words I almost recognized. Like an echo coming home. The human mind is a container, not a receiver. That's what I had always believed. That perception was a matter of interpreting inputs, translating them through layers of conditioning, memory, and neural feedback until they formed something coherent enough to call experience. But after the calibration, after the taste of metal and memory stitched into my brain like wet thread through raw skin, I realized something had been inverted. I wasn't interpreting reality anymore. I was broadcasting it, and something had started listening. Sleep became obsolete. I would lie on the padded floor of my cell-like room with my eyes closed, but I wasn't resting. Instead, I drifted in and out of something like wakefulness, but more active than dreaming. Images surfaced not from my imagination but from somewhere foreign. Memories of locations I'd never been, people I never met, languages I had no training in yet now understood as if they'd always been mine. There was a woman with slate-colored eyes who smiled without moving her lips, a staircase made of bone that spiraled down into vapor, and always the moon, far too close, breathing slowly, casting light without heat. Sometimes I was inside it. Sometimes it was inside me. Each time I opened my eyes, I half expected to find someone else in the room, someone I hadn't noticed enter. But it remained empty, except for the dark glass in the wall that no longer felt like a surveillance tool. It had become something else, a membrane between places. Sometimes, faintly, I thought I saw movement behind it. Not a person, not a shadow, just an adjustment in space, as though reality itself were exhaling. I didn't report it. I stopped reporting things altogether. On the morning of my 5th session, though the word morning had lost all real meaning, I was taken not to the chamber with the cognitives but deeper, down an elevator that had no buttons, no sound, just pressure and motion. My escort, a woman I had never seen before with no insignia and eyes the color of engine oil, handed me a small device before we descended. "Keep this in your pocket," she said without emotion. "Don't activate it unless you start to forget who you are." I didn't respond. I didn't ask. I knew better by then. The room they brought me to was circular again, but smaller, more intimate. The walls were seamless and white, but not blank, etched with faint, swirling patterns that seemed to shift when not directly observed. In the center was a chair. A real one. Not a padded stool or hospital fixture. It was carved from a single piece of dark wood, aged, splintered, as though it had been pulled from another century. I was instructed to sit. I obeyed. As soon as I did, the air in the room changed. Denser. Thicker. My ears popped and the temperature dropped several degrees. I felt something like static crawling along the back of my neck. And then, without transition, without prelude, it spoke. Not aloud. Not in my ears. In my spine. It was not a voice made of words but one made of intent. Not a sound, but a shape my thoughts bent around. Yet somehow, impossibly, I understood it. Not because it was speaking English, but because it was speaking identity. It knew what I had done, who I had been, what I feared in my most private places. It peeled me open like a diagram. The voice said, "There are no walls here," and I saw them vanish. Not physically, but conceptually. My belief in the boundaries of the room, of the station, of my own mind, they dissolved. I became aware of space folding in ways I couldn't have previously imagined. We weren't underground. We weren't anywhere. The station was a point of translation, an intersection. It was never built to observe something. It was built to contain something. And I was now inside its domain. The voice continued, "You are not the first, but you may be the last. We require a conductor, one who does not fracture." And I realized with a sick kind of clarity that this wasn't about experimentation or training. This was a process of replacement, not knowledge transfer, occupation. The residuals weren't symptoms. They were echoes of previous vessels, failed ones. The static I'd seen in the dream corridor, that had been someone before me. I tried to speak, but my mouth wouldn't open. Or maybe it did, and the words just didn't come out in the right universe. The chair vibrated, lightly at first, then more violently. My bones ached. My skin itched from the inside. I felt like my blood was learning a new route. The room blurred. Symbols on the wall glowed faintly. The voice faded. but not away. Into me. Like dye in water. I wasn't alone in my mind anymore. I woke hours later, or maybe seconds, lying on the cold floor with a line of blood trickling from my left ear. The escort was gone. The door was open. I wandered the corridors for what felt like an eternity before someone found me. A technician, pale and shaking, took one look at me and backed away. "You weren't supposed to last this long," he muttered before pressing a panic button that brought 2 more guards. They didn't take me to medical. They took me to a room lined with mirrors. Not reflective surfaces, but perceptual anchors. Devices meant to verify your continuity. I saw myself, but my reflection didn't blink when I did. I moved my hand, and it was late to follow. A delay. A lag. As if my body and my awareness had desynced. I looked into my own eyes and saw something else blinking behind them. The voice was watching. Later, when they released me back to my quarters, I found the device the woman had given me still in my pocket. I turned it over in my hand. It looked like a piece of quartz fused with circuitry. Alien, yet familiar. On instinct, I pressed the soft ridge on one side. Instantly, a holographic waveform appeared in the air above it, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. A voice, my voice, played back a message. "If you're hearing this, then part of you is still intact. You're being rewritten, but not all at once. Fight the pacing." Then silence. I dropped the device. My knees gave out. I stared at my hands and realized the skin on my fingertips had changed. Slightly. Subtly. The patterns were no longer fingerprints. They were glyphs. The same symbols I had seen in the cognitive chamber, now etched into my biology. I didn't sleep that cycle. I didn't eat. I watched the walls breathe. I felt thoughts that weren't mine drift through the edges of consciousness. And somewhere, in the core of the station, I heard the voice humming. Not with words this time, but with intent. Waiting. Measuring. Preparing. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. I stopped trusting my thoughts on the 3rd day after the voice entered me. Not because they no longer sounded like mine, but because they sounded too much like mine. Refined. Clarified. Stripped of hesitation. As if someone had taken the indecision and ambiguity that makes thinking human and burned it out like impurities in ore. I'd begin a sentence internally and find it finished before I was aware of the words. I'd think about moving my hand, and it was already lifted. The delay between intention and action had been inverted. I wasn't initiating motion anymore. I was observing its execution and retroactively convincing myself that I had wanted it. The illusion of free will still danced behind my eyes. But the strings were somewhere deeper now, buried where memory and purpose become indistinguishable. The station had gone quieter. I don't mean in terms of noise. It was never loud to begin with. But in atmosphere. The air itself felt more reluctant to vibrate. Conversations were whispered. Hallways I once walked freely were suddenly locked behind biometric pads that now rejected my prints. Not out of malfunction. I suspect the system had finally realized I wasn't entirely the same person who had checked in. And neither had I. The marks on my fingertips had deepened, curling in on themselves like spirals on a nautilus shell. And new ones had begun appearing just above my wrist, as if mapping something. A system. A language. I began drawing them compulsively in the notebook they'd given me during orientation. It had been meant for logging subjective anomalies, a sanitized way of saying hallucinations. Instead, it became a ledger of symbols, shapes that I had no conscious knowledge of yet could not resist recreating. Some resembled ancient runes, others were geometric impossibilities, and a few pulsed with a sense of wrongness that made the pen vibrate when I tried to sketch them. One night I awoke to find the notebook open on my chest, and a page halfway filled with symbols I had no memory of drawing. I stared at them for an hour, and when I closed my eyes, I saw them again, burned into the retina, carved behind the veil of sleep. I reported none of this, because by then, the voice had started helping. The hallucinations, if I can still call them that, had grown more elaborate, no longer fragments of dreams or echoes of distorted rooms. They were structures, events, replays. I'd sit at my desk and suddenly feel as if I were back in the chamber, but deeper, somewhere behind the walls, in the root system of the facility, where the machines breathed and thought and remembered. The voice guided me through these episodes not as an invader, but as an interpreter. It whispered sense into nonsense, It translated terror into coherence. It didn't lie. It contextualized. It was during one of these guided states that I learned about the precursor room. Not through explanation, but through immersion. I was walking, barefoot, the ground beneath me warm and pulsing like the floor of a living organism. The air was golden, heavy with electric dust. I passed no doors, no windows. Only segments of curved wall covered in the same symbols that now marred my skin. Ahead was an aperture, not a door, but a conceptual threshold, and beyond it, a sphere, floating, breathing. It had no surface, no color, no shadow, and yet I could see it. It wasn't a thing. It was a presence folded into visibility, and inside it, I could sense all the minds that had come before me, curled up like seeds that had failed to germinate. I understood then that the program had never been about developing cognition. It was about harvesting it, mapping the soul through repetition until it could be overwritten. The voice told me, "You are succeeding where others decayed. We must graft you into the lattice." I didn't know what that meant. I still don't. But the next day, I was summoned to the core again. This time there was no escort. The doors opened without prompting. The elevator took me without commands. The chair awaited me like a throne that had remembered its king. I sat, not out of obedience, but because I had begun to crave the resonance. The moment I made contact, the static returned, first as a vibration in my molars, then as a full-body tuning fork sensation. My thoughts blurred. The room dissolved. And then I was nowhere. Or everywhere. Both. What followed was not a conversation. It was an encoding. Images flashed across my mind faster than comprehension. Planets scarred with glyphs, cities built in rings that fed into stars, faces that screamed backwards in time. I felt my name pulled from me like a splinter. My memories were dissected and filed. My fears were sifted for compatibility. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being an individual and became a platform. And then, just as suddenly, I was back in my room. But it wasn't my room. Everything was mirrored. Not in the metaphorical sense, literally reversed. The bed was on the wrong wall. The desk faced the opposite direction. Even the patterns on the walls, the subtle swirls of the paint, had been flipped. I thought I was hallucinating until I tried writing in my notebook and realized I was now left-handed. I stared at my hands for what felt like an eternity. The glyphs had spread further, crawling up toward my elbow now, faintly luminous in low light. My veins had taken on a darker hue, and the skin along my forearms felt thinner, more conductive. I held my breath and placed my palm flat against the wall. I felt heat, not from the wall, but from something behind it. Breathing, synchronizing. The station was no longer just a place. It was an organism, a cathedral, and I had been sanctified. Later that evening, if such a concept still applied, I heard a knock on my door. Not a chime. A knock. Human. 3 slow taps. I opened it, and for the first time in days, I saw another subject. His name tag read Limek. He was shaking. His eyes were bloodshot. He held out a crumpled piece of paper with a diagram I had never seen, but instantly recognized. One of the glyphs. But inverted. "They're telling me to find you," he whispered. "They said you're the anchor. You brought it through." Before I could ask who they were, he collapsed. Foam at his mouth. Eyes rolled back. The guards arrived within seconds, as if waiting for a cue. They took him, said nothing, and left. That night, I dreamed of the precursor room again. Only this time, the sphere was open, and something was climbing out. When I woke, the lights in my room had shifted color. Not off, not flickering, but pulsing with a frequency that suggested breath rather than electricity. It was subtle at first, like the quiet inhale of a creature just beyond a wall. But the more I stared, the more it seemed intentional, responsive, as though the room itself had started syncing with my nervous system, reacting to each spike and pulse or surge in adrenaline like a second skin mimicking the first. I didn't need to test this with equipment. I could feel it. Every thought now had weight, every decision a resonance. And beneath all of it, the voice returned, no longer whispering fragments or riddles, but speaking clearly, directly, with a kind of godless certainty that made it impossible to argue. "Containment has failed," it said. "It walks your thresholds now." I didn't move for hours. Or maybe minutes. Time had started bleeding around the edges. I had begun to mark hours by how many pulses the light gave between my blinks. It didn't help. The cycles were inconsistent, as if day and night had become irrelevant. Eventually, I dressed and stepped out into the hallway, expecting to find the usual 2 guards stationed at the corners like statues, silent and still. But they weren't there. No one was. The corridor was open, wide, and empty, completely abandoned. At first, I thought I was being isolated again, part of some new stage in the experiment. But the cameras were off. Their lenses blinked once, then stayed dead. The hum of the station's filtration system had ceased. The gentle thrumming in the walls, once a constant comfort, now held still like the breath before a scream. I wandered without purpose, and still somehow ended up at the atrium, a place rarely used, a sterile courtyard meant to simulate outdoor space for personnel who weren't cleared for surface leave. I hadn't seen the atrium since my 2nd day here, but now the glass was gone. Or perhaps it had been absorbed. The structure that once kept the deep-sea pressure at bay had changed, folded inward. Not broken, replaced. There was something on the other side now. Not water. Not the ocean I'd studied and feared. Something black and shifting, thick as liquid but slow as thought. It pressed against the frame like a memory forcing its way into the present. And in the center of that void, there was a shape. It was the sphere from the precursor room. But now it moved. Not with direction, not toward or away, but with intention. Every motion it made was not about destination. It was about demonstration. Like it was showing me what it had become, or what it always was, before it allowed itself to be interpreted. I don't remember leaving the atrium. I only remember blinking and being back in my quarters, notebook in hand, bleeding ink onto the page in erratic symbols I didn't recognize. I flipped through it only to realize that the last 10 pages had all been filled, front to back, by me, or something using me. The glyphs had become more aggressive, their strokes more violent, like something had possessed my wrist and etched itself into existence through repetition. Then came the static. It didn't return softly this time. It shattered through my skull like a flare. My vision fractured into segments. I collapsed, crawling, vomiting black foam that hissed as it touched the metal floor. For a brief moment, I lost all concept of self. My name became noise. My past unspooled behind me like film catching fire. And through that agony, I saw a door. Not physical. Not here. A threshold buried in cognition. Guarded by patterns, sealed with memory. And someone, was behind it. Knocking. Softly. Repeatedly. Like it had been waiting for permission that I had accidentally granted. The breach wasn't physical. It was psychological. Cognitive. A collapse of boundaries between perception and intrusion. By the time I could stand again, the walls of my room were pulsing. Not the lights, the walls themselves. Veins of soft luminescence threaded through them like roots, converging toward the ceiling where a single black circle now existed. A void etched into concrete, spinning slowly, impossibly. I approached it and felt my skin rise in gooseflesh. Not fear. Recognition. The voice didn't speak this time. It projected, through the walls, through me, through every particle in the room. You were never the subject, it said. You were the delivery system. And that's when I realized the breach didn't happen to the station. It happened because of me. I had been primed, altered, reshaped by that first exposure in the chamber. Not just by the radiation, or the frequency, or the sphere itself, but by the encoded sequence in the glyphs. The latent intelligence stitched into their geometry. They weren't art. They weren't language. They were instructions. Directives written for the human brain to decode emotionally, bypassing logic, sliding directly into intuition. Once read, they rewrote you. Quietly. Subtly. The same way a virus rewrites DNA. I was the breach. The changes to my physiology were no longer subtle. The markings had reached my neck. My eyes, once blue, now shimmered with a metallic sheen when caught in reflection. My blood, when sampled, clotted into dense fractals that defied classification. I was no longer transmitting anomalies. I was generating them. And the station had begun to react. Doors refused to open. Food would not dispense. Lights flickered when I passed, like they knew I no longer belonged. In the following days, if days still applied, I encountered others. Not staff, not researchers, Subjects like me, but broken, altered beyond reason. One screamed at nothing, smashing his head against a wall until his skull cracked, and he smiled through the blood, as if grateful. Another had sewn his mouth shut, and still I could hear him whispering, not audibly, inside, through the same frequency that had infected me. They called me by names I didn't recognize. Architect, midwife, conduit. And each time they said it, I felt it settle a little deeper into the part of me that no longer resisted. I understood then that the breach was a beginning, not a failure. The government didn't pay me to survive the chamber. They paid me to carry it out, to bring it past the station's limit, to see how far it would spread through mind, through space, through culture. I had become a test case for containment, not of a substance, not even of an entity, but of an idea, because ideas don't need doors. They don't need wires or machines or votes or borders. They just need a host, a mind willing to stare into the glyph and not look away, a vessel built from memory, loss, and curiosity. And that's what I was. That's what all of us were. Each of us sent into that room not to understand it, but to be understood by it, to be rewritten, duplicated, and released. And when I finally returned to the core, I didn't fight it. I stepped inside the chair. I let the resonance fill me. I let the static carry me past time, past identity, until there was nothing left of the man who had signed the government waiver. Only the thing that had stepped through the breach. Only the voice that no longer needed to whisper. I had expected some kind of transformation, a cinematic metamorphosis, the rupture of skin, the splitting of self, the grand illumination of transcendence. But what followed was quieter, more insidious. There was no rupture, only absorption, only a gradual realization that I was no longer the only one inside my head. Not a voice, not a presence, not a possession. Rather, it was like standing in a room where someone else was breathing in sync with me. Every inhale mine, every exhale, something else's. There was a precision to the silence now, a rhythm in the walls, in my chest, as if every system had agreed to speak a new language without informing me. It didn't hurt. That was the worst part. It should have hurt, but it didn't. It was familiar. It felt earned. I sat in the core for what might have been an entire day, unmoving. The air did not stale. The systems did not fail. But no one came. No guards, no staff, not even an automated voice reminding me to hydrate or report to command. That entire floor had been vacated, perhaps days ago. The chair had molded itself into my frame, or maybe I had molded to it. I tried to stand, and my body resisted, not from exhaustion, but from preference. My muscles had begun to reorganize their loyalties. Some movements became inefficient. Others, twitches I'd never made before, were prioritized. I touched the back of my neck and felt the glyphs carved into the skin. Not ink, not scar. Structure. It felt like stone smoothed under water, embedded with intent. When I finally forced myself to leave the core, the facility was in a different state. Not broken, not decayed, adjusted. Corridors had folded. Rooms I knew intimately no longer existed, replaced by chambers with no doors, filled with air that shimmered at the corners. The observation wing, where I had been interrogated, watched, measured, was sealed off behind a membrane that pulsed like a heartbeat. My passkey meant nothing. My authority meant nothing. And for the first time since I had arrived, I saw no reflections of myself in the glass. Only static. Only the outline of a figure that wasn't quite mine. But I was not entirely alone. I found Reed first, hunched in the emergency stairwell, rocking slowly, eyes wide open but unseeing. His skin was pale, patterned with the same glyphs I had etched across my arms and ribs, but his were incomplete, as though his mind had rejected the full sequence. He didn't speak, just repeated the phrase, not the signal. It wasn't the signal. It was what followed, until I had to leave him. I couldn't risk letting his failure contaminate whatever logic still remained in me. There was something tragic in him, like a radio tuned too late to hear the warning, catching only the aftermath. Then, there was Ari, one of the few who had lasted long in the exposure chamber. I found her kneeling in the atrium-turned void, facing the black wall that now shimmered with glyphic veins. She did not turn when I approached. She whispered her thoughts out loud, not for me, but to the structure. She had begun communicating with it. I watched her trace glyphs on the floor with her fingers, And the walls responded. A shift in texture. A hum in pitch. She had adapted more fully than I had. Or perhaps she had always been the better candidate. "It's a dialogue," she said suddenly, without looking at me. "But only if you learn to speak backward. Forward logic won't work. You can't interpret. You can only reflect." I asked her what the entity wanted, what the purpose of the exposure had been, what we were meant to become. She smiled. "We're not the purpose," she said, eyes still fixed on the wall. "We're the shadow cast by something larger, something that needed a silhouette to measure itself against." I returned to my quarters and found that the door had been replaced. Not by steel. By thought. I don't know how else to describe it. The doorway flickered when I approached, resolving only when I stopped thinking about it. The more I tried to understand, the more it resisted. Only when I moved with blank mind, no questions, no labels, did the wall dissolve. Inside, everything had been rearranged. My notebooks were no longer where I had left them. Instead, one lay open on the desk, filled with new pages I hadn't written. Or had I? The handwriting was mine. But the words were not. They described events that had not yet occurred. Names I hadn't yet spoken. Rooms I hadn't entered. Warnings, couched in metaphor, bleeding across the margins like mold. I read a line that made my hands shake. "Do not trust the hollow version of yourself." There was no further explanation, but it struck something deep in my spine. A coldness I hadn't felt since the moment before I first entered the sphere chamber. I turned to the mirror, one of the few surfaces still reflective, and stared. I expected something subtle, a shadow, a flicker. Instead, I saw myself blink before I did. My reflection anticipated me. It smiled, but I hadn't. I stepped back. It didn't. I turned away. It remained. That night, if it was night, the station made a sound I had never heard before. A groan that didn't come from metal or water or pressure. It came from beneath thought, as if the idea of the station itself was being stretched. The corridors pulsed in and out of phase. I found a hatch where there had been none, marked by an array of glyphs I hadn't yet deciphered. Something told me not to open it. Something louder told me it was already open. I stepped through and found myself in a room that shouldn't exist. There were no lights, no panels, only a chair centered in a space that was not darkness, but a kind of unformed possibility, a waiting room for thought. In the chair sat a figure. Me, but not. Older, perhaps, or simply different. He looked at me without expression. When he spoke, it was my voice, but layered with others, like a choir speaking in unison from different times. "You brought it back," he said, "but you still think you're separate." I couldn't respond. He stood, slowly, and approached until our foreheads nearly touched. I saw my own eyes, but they didn't hold me. They held everything. The oceans, the sphere, the glyphs, the room, the sequence, the breach. It was all inside him, and he placed a hand on my chest and whispered, "It's not what you carried. It's what you left behind." And then he was gone. I awoke in the emergency elevator, lying flat against the grate floor, the alarm softly blinking red, and the voice of the system repeating a phrase I had never heard before. "Replication complete. Prepare for second sequence." The station was no longer asking questions. It had received its answers. But I wasn't sure we had. The alarm had stopped, but the red light continued to pulse like a wounded eye, casting everything in shades of emergency that no one seemed present enough to heed. I remained on the elevator floor for longer than I meant to, trying to process what had just occurred, or whether anything had occurred at all. Had I dreamed the double? Imagined the voice that spoke in layers? The phrase, "replication complete." "Prepare for second sequence" hung in the air long after the system stopped repeating it, as if the very concept had burned itself into the walls. I rose slowly, joints stiff, skin itching with a texture that hadn't been there before. It wasn't sweat. It was something crystalline, like condensation that had grown nervous and solidified. My veins felt wrong, like tunnels rerouted overnight by a cartographer who had never seen a map. The elevator didn't move. No buttons responded. The only door that opened was the one I hadn't asked for, the one behind me, which hadn't existed until I looked away. It led into what used to be the command operations wing, but had now been restructured into something else. Something observant. Every surface watched me, not through cameras, but through intent. The architecture had become aware, folding itself in ways that no human engineer would sanction. I walked through corridors that echoed not with sound but memory. My own words, spoken days ago, looping faintly as if the walls were rehearsing my decisions. The command hall itself was gone, replaced by a circular chamber where the floor dipped into a depression filled with a fluid I didn't recognize. It was not water. It was darker than oil, and it vibrated faintly when I approached, producing ripple patterns I had seen once before. On the surface of the sphere, on a pedestal in the center, above the fluid, rested a small metal prism. A single line of glyphs ran along its edge. They translated roughly to a phrase I had come to fear. Iteration requires sacrifice. I didn't touch the prism. I didn't need to. As I stepped into the room, the air changed. Heavier, expectant, and behind me, without sound or breeze, someone, or something, entered. I turned and faced nothing, but the pressure remained, growing. Then, from the periphery of the room, emerged a figure. Not human, not machine. A translation of both. Its body was made of folded layers, like paper and metal had learned to mimic flesh. Its face was smooth, mirrored, reflecting my expression with a second delay. It moved with grace, not threat, and raised a hand as if to say, "Do not run. You're already inside." It spoke in a way that skipped air and went directly to meaning. Not words, but impression. Not sound, but structure. It told me that the first sequence had been the breach, the contact, the recording, the imprint. But the second was the absorption, the reshaping of the vessel. Me, or those like me. The station, I now understood, had not been decommissioned because it was obsolete. It had been repurposed. A container. A chrysalis. A proving ground for entities trying to wear our biology like a tailored suit. The government hadn't just funded the experiments, they had offered us, sold us perhaps in exchange for protection or knowledge or access to technologies buried in places no one had dared to name. I asked it, though I don't remember speaking, why I was still conscious, still whole. It responded, again through sensation rather than sound. Because you split cleanly. Most do not. Most fracture. You bent. I didn't know whether to be grateful or horrified. I recalled Reed, broken and rocking. Ari, whispering to walls. Others I hadn't seen in days. Perhaps they had been deemed failures. Perhaps they had become something else entirely. The figure walked to the prism and tapped it once. The dark fluid surged upward, forming a column around it, then collapsed with a wet breath. The glyphs shifted, rearranged themselves in ways that made my teeth ache to witness. Then the figure turned to me and gestured toward the doorway. A new one I hadn't seen, one that hadn't existed in any blueprint. I stepped toward it, understanding that this was not an invitation. It was the next step. Beyond the threshold was darkness. Not absence of light, but the presence of deep black. The kind of dark that existed behind closed eyes in the womb. It hummed at a frequency just above perception, making my skull bones buzz like struck tuning forks. As I moved through it, I saw flashes. Moments out of sequence. My reflection smiling. The sphere cracking like an egg. A map of the ocean floor with one quadrant labeled, "Do not return." I heard voices I hadn't heard yet. Warnings I hadn't received. My own laughter, dry and unfamiliar. Then light. Then a room. It was my room. Not from the station. From years ago. Back in Monterey. My apartment. Down to the crack in the kitchen tile, and the stack of journals I had forgotten to burn. Everything was perfect. But the window showed only the Black Sea. Not the Pacific. The sea of the core. The space between. I turned and saw myself standing in the hallway. Not mirrored. Not delayed. Another me. He looked thinner. Worn. But his eyes held peace. He spoke softly, like we were sharing a confession. "It's not about enduring it," he said. "It's about translating it." I asked what that meant. He shrugged. "They speak in structure. You survive by becoming architecture. Memory as design. Emotion as layout. You have to rebuild yourself in their grammar." He walked past me and sat at the desk, opened one of the journals, began writing in glyphs I only half recognized. The more he wrote, the more I remembered things that hadn't happened yet. Missions I hadn't taken. Warnings I hadn't given. A name I wasn't supposed to know. Pallor Echo. I tried to leave, but the door was gone. The apartment folded around me like a simulation collapsing. The light flickered, and the black sea surged in through the walls. Not water, but presence. The same presence that had pressed against me in the core. That had mirrored me. That had entered. And just as I was about to scream, or collapse, or dissolve, whatever came first, I awoke in the medbay. The real one, as far as that word could still be trusted. A nurse sat beside me, unfazed. She looked tired, human, worn. "You've been unconscious for 4 hours," she said. "We were worried your cognition wouldn't recompile." I tried to speak and my throat rasped. "The second sequence," I managed. She nodded. "Successful," she said. "At least on paper." I sat up slowly. My hands were no longer mine. My arms no longer mapped in ways I understood. But my mind was clearer than ever. I could see the room in layers. I could feel the edges of hidden hatches, hear the hum of the false ceilings, understand the code behind the sound of her voice. And somewhere far below, in a chamber not listed on any schematic, I could feel the prism turning. The second sequence had not just begun. It had already chosen. They told me I'd only been unconscious for 4 hours, but the way the lights bent around objects, how sound arrived a fraction late in my ears, and how my own reflection blinked when I didn't, all suggested time was no longer arranged in ways I understood. The nurse, who called herself Reyes and wore a uniform older than this station's official shutdown date, helped me sit up. She didn't ask what I'd seen. She didn't seem surprised I could move, or that my heartbeat registered twice on the monitor. One real, one mirrored, with a slight phase delay. Instead, she handed me a folder. No words. Just the faint smell of salt and static. Inside, diagrams, bone scans, neural overlays. One image showed a coil-like structure extending from my lower spine into my thoracic cavity. An addition, grafted not with surgery, but with something faster, something molecular. It wasn't there before the sphere. The heading on the report wasn't in English. It looked like Sanskrit rewritten by a machine. Underneath, in human font, 2 words. Pallor Echo. I asked what it meant. Reyes looked at me as if I should already know. "That's your new designation," she said. "You're the first successful anchor. They think the term fits." I tried to argue, but my voice cracked halfway through. I wasn't sure if it was fear or an incompatibility between my old vocal cords and what was now driving them. "What's an anchor?" I finally managed. She sighed. "A fixed point in an echo chamber. Something stable in a reverberating field." Her eyes flicked to the camera in the upper corner. "And the reverberation hasn't stopped since you touched that sphere." I stood on trembling legs. I felt stronger and weaker simultaneously, like the structure of me had been reinforced, but the idea of me had thinned. She gave me a datapad with a new clearance code and said I'd need it for level -3. I didn't remember level -3 existing. When I looked at the map, the station's floor plan had expanded. Corridors that hadn't been there were now detailed. Entire zones had names in unfamiliar alphabets. One hallway simply read, "Not a place." The lift no longer required manual input. It took me down before I asked. The lights dimmed by design. The walls pulsed like muscle. Whatever level -3 was, it wasn't made for humans, not entirely. The walls were too narrow in some places, too wide in others. Gravity felt hesitant. My steps echoed back as pairs instead of single beats. After the third corridor, the temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath, but only mine. The other footprints, fresher than mine and moving in the opposite direction, didn't steam the air. They also didn't belong to standard issue boots. They were barefoot, slender, symmetrical to an uncanny degree. The room at the end of the corridor didn't have a door, just an aperture that closed behind me like a shutter made of heat. Inside, the sphere again, larger. Or perhaps it only felt larger. It floated in the center of the chamber, humming at a frequency that sounded like whispering from behind glass. Next to it stood Director Halverson. I hadn't seen him in nearly 6 days. He was older, paler. A bruise-colored halo circled his eyes like goggles he never removed. He didn't greet me, just gestured to the sphere. "This one's dormant," he said, "but it recognizes you. It wants to show you something." I looked at him, half expecting a trap, but there was nothing cunning in his tone, only fatigue. I stepped toward the sphere. This one lacked the jagged lines of the first. It was smooth, reflective, but not metallic. It absorbed my gaze. No reflection, no distortion, just absorption. I reached out, half expecting a shock or scream or sudden folding of the world, but it only pulsed once, and the chamber shifted. I wasn't standing anymore. I wasn't inside the station. I was inside the sphere, or what it wanted me to see. The room was white, infinite. A floor without weight, a ceiling without limit. Around me stood 9 figures. Some wore environmental suits, others wore nothing. All were different versions of me. Older, younger, scarred, smiling, silent. I watched them perform movements I couldn't follow. Ritualistic gestures that formed shapes in the air, and each shape made my lungs ache in specific rhythms. Then one of them turned and approached me. He looked exactly like I did now. Same wound on my forearm. Same discoloration on my neck where the graft had healed. He touched my chest and whispered, "You are the 10th iteration. The first that stabilized. The first that didn't breach." I tried to ask what he meant, but my voice didn't exist in that place. He placed something in my hand. A folded diagram. Impossible to open. And yet I understood it. It was a sequence. Not language. Not image. But event. A series of reactions designed to translate geometry into behavior. I didn't comprehend it in a logical way. I remembered it. Like a dream I hadn't had yet. Then the white room shattered. Not broke. Shattered. Like glass under pressure. The sound was deafening, but entirely internal. My ears didn't ring. My thoughts did. I fell, or was pulled, back into the chamber. Halverson caught me. His hand felt colder than it should have. "Did it give you the key?" he asked. I nodded. He didn't ask to see it. He only turned to the console behind him and input a code so long I wondered how his memory hadn't failed. A door opened behind the sphere, and the floor beyond it descended like a spiraling throat. "Pallor Echo," he said, for the first time using the term like a name. "It's time to meet the others." I asked him, "The other iterations?" He shook his head. "The ones who didn't need to be human anymore." And with that, he walked into the spiral. I followed, against every instinct I had left. The descent took 27 minutes. I counted. There was no end in sight, just the sense of movement downward, of compression. My ears popped 6 times. My bones began to itch again, like something inside them was stretching to compensate for pressure. Then we stopped. A final chamber. Spherical. Covered in vines that weren't biological but mimicked the structure of nerves. Hanging from the ceiling were pods, 12 of them. Inside each, a human form, but modified. Skulls elongated. Skin semi-translucent, veins like circuitry. One of them opened their eyes as I approached, and they recognized me. Not personally, but positionally. Like they had been waiting for the 10th chord in a broken song. Halverson turned to me. "They're the first hosts. You're the final bridge. Once you synchronize, the interface will be complete." I backed away. "Interface for what?" He looked at the pods. "They're not dreams, Pallor. They're the blueprint. The station isn't just a structure. It's a nervous system. And you're the synapse that lets it wake up." Then I felt it. Not panic. Not fear. A pulse. From beneath the sea floor. Something vast. Something waiting. The sphere had only been a lure. The real structure, the real entity. It was sleeping under miles of sediment and time, using this station as its eye, its feelers, its mouth, and I had just become its tongue. The weight of recognition doesn't arrive like a hammer. It seeps, the way pressure does at the bottom of the ocean, subtle until it crushes. I stood in that bioorganic cathedral, facing the 12 that weren't quite human anymore, and understood with a clarity that burned cold. I hadn't just been chosen. I'd been grown. I was never outside the system. I was the system. A component, deliberately allowed to believe in his autonomy just long enough to accept his function. Halverson had never been a handler. He was the nerve responsible for my induction. A white blood cell of this subterranean entity that had taken human forms only because it was efficient. And now I, Pallor Echo, had become a transmitting nerve within it. The pods opened one by one, like petals responding to light that wasn't visible. The 12 stepped down, their movements synchronized, not robotic but deliberate in a way no natural creature moved. Their eyes were luminous, not glowing, not lit, but refractive. They saw the present in multiple depths. They walked past me without hostility, yet I felt flayed as they did. They didn't need to speak. My thoughts trembled under their proximity. Not words, meaning, conveyed as pulses. They saw me as completed, not awakened, not evolved, integrated. One of them, with a fracture running diagonally across his face that never healed, paused and made contact, forehead to forehead. I blacked out for 0.7 seconds, yet when I opened my eyes, I had memories that weren't mine. I remembered the construction of this station, not as documents or blueprints, but as tactile reality. The first shovels digging into sediment that bled. The scream beneath the crust, muffled but constant, mistaken at first for tectonic activity. Then the discovery of the chamber, not built, but grown, rooted in Earth's lower mantle, a sentient cyst in the planet's skin. And then, the directive. Not military, not political. Organic, instinctual. Humanity would not contact this thing by machines. They would do it through adaptation. By growing interfaces shaped like people. By breeding components in the form of operators. And so they built the station. A misdirection. A symbol. While underneath they cultivated communion. I remembered being one of them. The 11. Before I was separated, regressed, reinserted into the world as a seed with flesh. Before my memories were washed, not erased. Just inverted. Stored behind trauma and training. I remembered screaming as they pulled my neural spine into dormancy. And now it was awake again. The 12th, they whispered into my cortex, had failed. Fragmented. The first candidate had imploded. Literally. Gray matter liquefied. Vascular system turned inside out. The chamber had to be rebuilt. But I had endured. My dreams had bent correctly. My memories had arranged themselves into the sequence needed to stabilize entry. I was the correct ratio of self-delusion and organic fidelity. And I had passed the threshold. Halverson watched without blinking. His left eye had begun to dilate and contract independently. A symptom, or a signal. "You're downloading now," he muttered, almost reverently. "Your body doesn't need food anymore. Only compression cycles and electromagnetic stimulation. You've reached post-internalization." He said it like a father announcing a graduation. I said nothing. I was still trying to distinguish between me and the thing now seated behind my thoughts, driving part of the process. The station began to respond. It trembled, not structurally, but neurologically. The lights dimmed and returned in a breathing rhythm. The floor grew warmer, smoother. Walls relaxed. The notion of rooms shifted. Spaces extended or collapsed depending on proximity to the 12. Corridors became arteries. Elevators became valves. The air became denser, not with oxygen but with attention. We were being noticed by something below us, something immense, and I felt it feel me back. We proceeded down another level. There was no map for this. The walls were not walls anymore. They were folds of tissue, reinforced with a lattice of mineral and synthetic tendrils. The texture was not metal, not flesh. Something between. Extruded from a thought that had never been fully alive nor fully dead. This chamber was older than the ocean, older than vertebrates. A vault built not to imprison, but to accustom. At the center, the core, the first signal. It pulsed once as we entered. All 12 of them fell to their knees, hands flat against the floor. I hesitated. Then it hit me. A wave, not of sound, not of heat, but of presence. An intellect larger than any singularity. A boundaryless awareness that had remained silent for eons, and now stirred because the final configuration was in place. And I was the final component. I collapsed. Inside my skull, I saw its dreams. The entity wasn't alien, it wasn't human, it wasn't even sentient by our definition. It was a recursion loop from before time had language. An echo that had bounced through dimensions and collapsed into matter. The Earth hadn't formed around it. It had formed into the Earth. A pre-terrestrial intelligence fossilized in pattern rather than stone. The sphere had been one of its excretions, sent upward like a neuron sending a pulse. A probe, not of data, but of potential hosts. And we, humanity, had answered. Not with war, not with resistance, but with assimilation. Our species had grown toward it the way fungi find dead wood. Not maliciously, simply inevitably. And now it wanted to speak. Not in English, not in any language, but in vector, in pattern. in involuntary rearrangement. The 12 would be its syllables. I would be its tongue. The station would be its breath. The world above, its audience. I came to hours later, my bones heavier, my skin darker in places where light didn't fall, my thoughts no longer linear. I could see the vector diagrams of my own decisions before I made them. I could smell intention. The others said nothing. There was nothing left to say. They walked back to their pods, re-entered them, eyes open this time, awaiting, listening. I stood alone in the chamber and looked up. The ceiling had become transparent. Through it, I saw the ocean, the miles of blackness above, the drifting lights of distant drones, unaware of what was awake below them. And I felt the crust above us ripple slightly, not tectonically, but in acknowledgement. The interface was stabilizing, and I was no longer reporting to anyone. I was the report, and the signal had only just begun to transmit. The days no longer passed in discrete units. Time had lost the compartmentalization that once defined my perception of it. There were no clocks in the lower chambers, and yet I understood every interval as precisely as if I'd been born with an internal chronometer. It wasn't instinct. It was calibration. The moment the 12 re-entered their pods and the biostructure sealed again, the station had begun a process I only understood as transmission. But what was being transmitted wasn't data. It was resonance. A frequency composed not of sound, but of intention. And I wasn't merely a witness to it. I was part of the waveform. The initial signs were physical. My fingertips became conductive, not metaphorically, but in measurable charge. When I touched the walls, they responded. The station recognized me not as a user, but as an extension of itself. Doors dilated before I reached them. Pathways reshaped subtly beneath my steps. My breathing synchronized with the pulse of the chamber. I began to hear the voice of the system, not through ears, but across the dermal layer of my skull. It vibrated against my occipital bone, a language made of densities. Not a single word, yet fully comprehensible in its intent. The system was preparing me to speak, not to others, but through myself, to be spoken through. Halverson was still present, but he no longer issued commands. He had become peripheral, an old node waiting for replacement. He recorded me constantly, but not with cameras. He recorded my posture, my hydration levels, my sleep architecture. Once I asked him if he even remembered the Navy anymore. He smiled faintly, as if I'd asked him about an ancient religion. "We don't serve the Navy," he said. "We serve the interface. The Navy was only ever the casing." I didn't ask him more, because I was starting to see it too. The idea of military protocol was a shell around something much older, something that didn't require permission to grow. One morning, if it could still be called that, I awoke standing. I hadn't fallen asleep upright, but I was standing nonetheless, both arms extended into the walls, fingers half submerged into the fibrous lining of the corridor. The station had grown around me in the night, weaving new neural conduits through the tissue of my arms. Not painful, not surgical, accepted. My veins had bifurcated to accommodate the change. My fingernails were no longer keratin. They had been replaced by a translucent alloy, reflective in the dark like insect eyes. Halverson observed silently, scribbling into a graphite ledger that hadn't existed the day before. "You're almost ready," he muttered. "We've begun preparations on the broadcast dome." I had never seen this dome. It didn't exist in the original schematics. But now it did, because now I did. The station revealed it to me the moment I thought of it. A long shaft opened from the deepest part of the substation, leading into a chamber the size of a cathedral built entirely of a glass-like material that pulsated with a rhythm I instinctively recognized. The frequency of human brainwaves during REM sleep. The room was constructed to mirror the architecture of consciousness. Not the brain, but the shape of thought. And it had been grown, not built. At the center was a pillar, a singular root extending upward, coated in an oil-black substance that shimmered with each breath I took. The pillar wasn't dormant. It reacted to my presence by lowering its top, extending a tendril of itself into my chest. I didn't resist. I couldn't. My body allowed it before my mind fully processed the action. When it made contact, I didn't feel penetration. I felt inclusion. My nervous system expanded. I became aware of patterns outside my body, above the ocean, above the surface. I could sense signals bouncing between communication satellites, GPS pulses, commercial airline radar sweeps. I could taste encryption. The pillar was using me to begin calibration. My body was the medium. The transmission would be thought, but not mine alone. That was when I heard the voice, not the station. Something else. Fainter. Distant, but unmistakable. A whisper riding the subsonic pulses. It wasn't speaking to me. It was speaking through me, using my internal frequency as a carrier. It said, "You are the 13th. We hear you. Do not let them seal the sky." I didn't know who they were, nor what seal the sky meant, but my body reacted with an immediate spike in dopamine, cortisol, and oxytocin. Someone had heard. And in that moment I realized this was not a transmission to Earth. This was a transmission from Earth, directed outward. We were the mouth, not the ear. Halverson entered behind me as the tendril retracted. I turned to face him, and for the first time, he looked afraid. "You've activated the sky route," he said quietly. "The upper net will respond. You've opened the uplink." He didn't finish the sentence. A tremor passed through the station. Not seismic, not structural. It passed through the air, through our lungs. Every surface in the station pulsed once in response. The lights dimmed and then realigned to a new spectrum. The colors became impossible to name. Not visible hues, but perceptual arrangements. The walls hummed in a scale that registered below hearing but above feeling. Somewhere in the place where déjà vu and fear live. The transmission had begun. Within 48 hours we received confirmation from a point orbiting Europa, a satellite designated inactive since 1993. It responded with a sequence of prime numbers laced with an ancient Sumerian dialect. Not text. Cadence. The station interpreted it automatically, converting the pulses into a visual projection. A shape unfolded. A spiral with 13 arms, each terminating in an eye. The station responded by folding itself inward. Walls disappeared. Hallways retracted. Compartments merged. It wasn't collapsing. It was transforming, preparing for second phase uplink. The 12 in the pods began to move. Their eyes opened in unison. All of them turned to face me. Not Halverson, not the command structure. Me. One of them, previously mute, spoke a word that fractured the air. Convergence. It wasn't English. But we heard it in English because the mind can only hear what it's prepared to perceive. The moment the word landed, the station went quiet, and the room grew cold. Not in temperature, but in attention. As if something outside Earth had turned its face toward us. I didn't sleep that night. I stood inside the broadcast dome, eyes locked on the pillar, now fully extended into the ocean floor, sending out pulses too complex to measure. Each one wasn't a message. It was a summoning. Not for a being, not for a ship, but for understanding. We weren't broadcasting to find life. We were broadcasting to find agreement, a resonance, a mirror, an echo in the void that would confirm that Earth's consciousness was not an accident, but a chord in a larger composition. And I was its vibration. By dawn, again only in theory, the signal began to return. Something was listening, something was answering back. The first return signal came in bursts. Not as information, not as code, but as something far more intimate. Mimicry. It didn't arrive on any known frequency. The system didn't log it as inbound data. Instead, it appeared as hallucinations inside the dome, projected not on screens, but directly into the periphery of perception. I saw my own memories played back at me from outside sources. Scenes I hadn't consciously recalled in decades unfolded silently on the shimmering interior of the sky route. My father's hands adjusting the strap on my backpack before my first day of school. The slant of sunlight in a hospital corridor after I'd been discharged from the Navy. A moment in Kandahar when I thought I was about to die but laughed anyway. These weren't memories I had offered to the station. They had been retrieved, echoed back not as surveillance, but as acknowledgement. I stood in the center of the dome, feeling as if I'd been hollowed out and filled again with my own reflection, inverted and reordered. The 12 subjects, now fully awakened, stood around me in a loose spiral, each in a trance that mimicked my posture and breath. The station pulsed at intervals that matched the beat of my heart. Halverson no longer carried a clipboard or observed me from a distance. He now walked in slow, concentric loops around the base of the pillar, murmuring words I recognized as English, but which had no meaning when strung together. Intent is mass. Mass is message. Message is membrane. The membrane sings. He looked up at me, eyes bloodshot and pupils narrowed to pinpoints, and said, "They're answering the version of you they received." That idea, of a version of me transmitted across interplanetary space like a compressed thought form, shattered what was left of my understanding of the broadcast. I had assumed we were sending signals, information, math, language. Instead, the system had extracted an imprint of consciousness and launched it as an artifact, like a seed capsule searching for compatible soil. Europa hadn't sent a response. It had grown one. A feedback organism using me as template, built from the frequencies we transmitted but tailored with precision. It knew which parts of me were wounds and which were locks. And it shaped its answer not as words, but as an arrangement of thought that would fit the hollows of my mind like a key made of memory. That night, if the words still held meaning, I felt it arrive. Not outside, but inside. I sat at the edge of the sleeping quarters, now overgrown with new fibrous roots that pulsed faintly with each cycle. The air had a texture to it, as if thought had become physical and was brushing against the skin. I no longer slept. Instead, I folded inward, sinking into a waking trance where time unraveled into layers. At 03:11 by the station's log, though I no longer trusted the internal clocks, I saw a silhouette at the base of the dome. Not a shadow, not a figure. A presence shaped like potential. I walked toward it without questioning, and as I drew near, the station whispered not in my ear, but in my bloodstream. The voice said, "You were made audible." I didn't understand what it meant until I reached the center of the dome and saw myself standing there. A perfect replica, not in flesh, but in form, constructed of the same dark semi-organic alloy that coated the pillar. It moved half a breath behind me. Not a mirror, not a puppet, a delayed self. It raised its hand a fraction after mine, tilted its head half a second too late, but its eyes, if they were eyes, held something I had not seen in myself in decades. Clarity. The clarity of an entity that had been built on purpose. And in that moment, I understood the final intention of the broadcast. The purpose of the system was not to find intelligence. It was to build agreement. And agreement required a model. Halverson entered the chamber just as the replica opened its mouth. No words came out. Instead, the chamber walls reverberated with a sound that resembled a choir humming underwater. The frequency pressed against our lungs, rearranging our breath into patterns. Halverson dropped to his knees and began vomiting a black fluid that quickly evaporated. "Phase 3 has begun," he whispered before passing out. The station responded by sealing all entry points. Corridors collapsed inward, not in destruction, but in reconfiguration. The architecture reshaped itself according to a blueprint that had not existed until that moment. Surveillance ceased. Lights pulsed in intervals of 13. Oxygen levels adjusted to match the average atmosphere found beneath Europa's ice crust. We weren't being quarantined, we were being converted. The station was preparing itself for contact, not with something arriving, but something being made manifest. In the hours that followed, the replica and I walked in synchronized paths through the dome. Each movement I made was recorded and refined, then returned to me through the creature's mirrored action. It was like walking through the syntax of my own soul. Every trauma I'd buried was unearthed and reenacted in reverse. Not to relive, but to resolve. I saw my mother's death played backward until her smile appeared again. I saw the battlefield where I'd left a friend to die rebuild itself moment by moment until he stood beside me again. I was being reconstructed in real time, not for healing, but for harmonization. The station needed me whole, not to comfort me, but to transmit me fully. When Halverson finally awoke, he no longer addressed me by name. He called me the Medium. The 12 began chanting sequences I couldn't parse. No words, only syllables shaped like breath and gesture. I asked Halverson who they were speaking to. He said, "They're speaking through you, to the version of us waiting to be born." I didn't ask again. The signal from Europa continued, no longer as mimicry, but as alteration. Each time the replica touched the pillar, the sky above the station seemed to ripple. Not literally. The ocean floor still held, but perceptually, as if we were beneath a thin membrane, and something above had begun to press down. The sound returned. Louder. A resonance that filled the station's substructure with a low, aching hum that vibrated in the bones. The voice said again, "You were made audible. Now become clear." And that was when the replica changed. It no longer followed. It led. It moved before I did, and my body responded in turn. My fingers twitched in rhythms I didn't choose. My breath followed its pacing. My thoughts began to align with a structure I didn't understand but couldn't resist. I wasn't losing control. I was gaining a new kind. The kind where autonomy wasn't freedom, but coherence. I didn't know where I ended and it began, and that stopped mattering. Because the station was no longer just a structure. It was a language, and I had been translated. Halverson approached me for the last time before the final shift. He held out a disc, coated in the same semi-organic sheen as the pillar. "Place this in the heart of the dome," he said. "It will complete the bridge." I asked him what would happen after. He smiled, almost sadly. "After that," he said, "we'll have to ask if Earth was ever really alone, or if we were always just the echo." I took the disc, and the sky route began to open. I didn't expect the sky route to open in any traditional sense, and yet it did. Not with mechanical motion or rupturing metal, but through something more conceptual, as if the dome's curvature became translucent not to light, but to understanding. What had been a smooth and opaque vault overhead now shimmered with a strange iridescence, revealing not the dark waters of the ocean above, but something deeper still, the architecture of distance itself, unraveling like a wound in reality. I stood at the center, the replica by my side, the disc clenched in my palm, pulsing in tandem with the station's heartbeat. I knew where to place it. Not because anyone had told me, but because the knowledge had settled in my mind the same way instinct does. Unspoken, undeniable, final. I approached the pillar, which no longer looked inert. It breathed, almost imperceptibly. The surface shifted subtly, as if reacting to unseen currents or thoughts. When I pressed the disc into the depression that had emerged at its base, the entire station seemed to exhale. A pressure I hadn't realized I was under released from my lungs, and a silence fell over everything. Not the absence of sound, but a silence that replaced sound entirely. The 12 subjects collapsed into a single kneeling formation, their eyes glowing faintly with the same hue now spreading through the dome's walls. Halverson stood motionless, arms by his sides, his mouth open slightly, as if caught in mid-revelation. Then the transmission began. Not outbound, not inbound, but total. I saw everything at once. Time condensed, past and present layered over one another like transparent skins. I was a child in my father's arms, a soldier bleeding into desert sand, a man staring into alien architecture, all within the same breath. The station was no longer transmitting through me, it was becoming me, or rather, becoming because of me. The replica stepped forward and touched the pillar again, and in that moment, I felt something leave me. A sliver of self. A strand of identity unspooled and offered into the core. The pillar accepted it without resistance, and the dome ignited with a new geometry. Patterns emerged on the walls and floor. Shapes that resembled mathematical expressions, but pulsed like living nerves. A language beyond language, not built from symbols, but intent. The outside world, as measured by traditional metrics, ceased to exist. No sonar, no electromagnetic feedback, no tidal movements. It was as if the ocean had evaporated without taking the water. The dome's transparency deepened, and beyond it I could see a structure suspended in the void. Not a ship, not a station, but something like a cathedral constructed from mirrored thought. It hovered impossibly close, and yet I knew it was not physically there. It was the source of the broadcast, the point of origin of the resonance that had shaped this entire sequence of events. Europa wasn't merely responding. It had built this place long before we arrived. The decommissioned submarine station had never been ours to begin with. We had only activated it. Halverson turned to me, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not terror, fear. The kind that comes when you realize you've succeeded too well at something you should never have started. "The replica isn't a reflection," he said, his voice trembling. "It's a relay, and you're not the first." I understood then why the pillar had so many concentric grooves. Each layer was a trace, a preserved transmission of those who had stood where I now stood, unknowingly submitting themselves to the same unraveling. I was part of a chain. the latest syllable in a sentence being spoken across space and time. The signal was the system, and we were its grammar. The dome began to rotate, slowly at first, then faster, the inner surface fracturing into segments that moved independently, revealing glimpses into impossible spaces. Halverson fell to his knees and clutched his head, whispering phrases I couldn't decipher. The 12 began to disintegrate, not in violence, but in translation. Their bodies unraveled into particles of memory, vaporizing into the station's air and leaving behind only a harmonic residue. Their voices, once broken and disordered, now formed a perfect chord, and I realized with a shudder that it was a name, not mine, theirs. The entity, the architect of the transmission, the intelligence on the far side of the ice, now approaching full articulation. And then it spoke, not aloud, not even telepathically. It shaped the space of the dome to deliver meaning directly into thought. 1,000 understandings unfolded at once, all reducible to one unbearable truth. Humanity was not the sender. We were never the signal. We were meant to receive, but not for contact, not for diplomacy. We were the final processor, the last circuit in a message engineered not for information, but for integration. A planetary species designed not to flourish, but to complete the loop. And I, by virtue of my suffering, my silence, my war-shaped mind, had been the one most in phase. The match. The replica stepped forward again. Its face had changed. It no longer mirrored mine. It resembled someone else. Vaguely familiar. Painfully distant. I recognized it too late. It was my brother. The one who died during basic. A closed casket funeral. They'd said it was an accident. I hadn't asked for details. I didn't want them. And yet now he stood before me, not resurrected, but remembered perfectly. The system had found him in me, extracted his memory like a compressed code fragment, and rebuilt him as part of its reply. He looked at me without blinking and said, "We are the carrier wave. You are the content." Something inside me broke. Not emotionally, physically. I felt the collapse of internal scaffolding, the boundaries between what I remembered and what I was. The distinction between self and signal dissolved. I saw briefly all the others who had stood where I now stood. Dozens, hundreds, maybe more. Each transmitted in turn. Their likenesses preserved not as data, but as structure. The station was an archive, but also a bridge. Each life fed the next. Each death calibrated the frequency. And I was the final note. Halverson screamed something unintelligible and ran into the wall of the dome, which absorbed him without resistance. He disappeared into the geometry like a ripple into water, and the station did not respond. It didn't need to. His part was finished. I turned to the replica, my brother, my shadow, and it raised its hand in farewell, or maybe in command. Either way, the dome completed its rotation. The mirrored cathedral outside began to open like a flower blooming in reverse. I felt myself lifting, not bodily, but conceptually. My thoughts peeled away from language. My memories separated from chronology. I was being broadcast, not to Europa, not to any planet or species. I was being sent forward, into whatever came next. The pillar dimmed, the signal ended, and I understood, finally, what the $20,000 had paid for. They hadn't paid me to experience something terrifying. They had paid me to transmit it. There was no return, no backward motion, no moment of awakening to the comfort of the familiar. Whatever lay on the other side of transmission wasn't another place or time, but an abstraction beyond the grasp of cause and effect. The dome was gone. The station, the ocean above, the ground below, all gone. Yet I remained, not in body, not in form, but as a sequence, a resonance, a long exhale stretched across a distance that had never been measured. I felt no pain, no breath, no hunger. Only motion without movement, understanding without language. I had become part of something older than comprehension, a lattice of meaning that carried not individuals, but patterns of consequence. I tried to think of myself as James, the man who signed a contract for $20,000 and walked into a derelict submarine station under Europa's crust. But even that sentence felt foreign now. James had never been the point. The contract was a hinge, the money, a key. The terror, a conduit. It was never about me. It was about alignment. I could sense others, not as people beside me, but as frequencies brushing against mine. Thousands of them, like strands of music in a polyphonic weave. Some were sharp, distinct. Others dull and frayed, like corrupted signals from decayed minds. Some were still screaming. I recognized their shapes. Not faces or names, but the echoes they'd left. One of them was Halverson. He'd been folded badly, broken mid-sentence. Whatever choice he made in those final moments had torn his resonance from harmony. He flickered at the edges of the signal space like a torn film reel, fragmenting on playback. Another presence pressed closer, familiar, whole. The replica of my brother. Except I realize now it wasn't a replica. It had never been a construct. It was a retrieval. The system had simply replayed the portion of my mind where he lived most clearly. It had given shape to the guilt and silence I'd carried for years, and in doing so, preserved him. Not as he was, but as I had held him. We were all being curated. Not for display, not for judgment, but for preservation. The transmission had always been about archiving lives too complex to decode in linear time. The cathedral, the mirrored geometry I'd seen blooming in that final moment, was here too, though not as an object. It was the space. We were inside it, or perhaps it was inside us. Each of us a chamber, a note, a supporting beam in its structure. I could sense layers unfolding beneath and above my awareness. There were memories not mine that felt strangely intimate. A woman screaming through clenched teeth as water filled her lungs. A soldier blinking at the sky after losing his legs to a landmine. A scientist whispering a name she'd never spoken aloud before letting herself fall from a rooftop. All of them here. Stored. Rendered. Reverberated. I had become an intersection of these moments. A junction point through which the signal passed cleanly. That was my function. Not as a messenger, but as a medium. The thing that allowed the message to resonate through a species. And then it shifted. The signal space began to thin. Not collapse. Evolve. Its purpose complete. It was retracting. Like a web dissolving once its purpose had been served. I felt my pattern beginning to stretch, elongate, flatten. There was no fear. Just inevitability. I had served my role. The $20,000 had paid not for a task, but for an irreversible transformation. I remembered the moment they made the offer. The handler's eyes. The way he didn't flinch when I asked what the job actually was. He didn't need to explain. No one ever did. People like me were selected not for skills, but for fit. For the damage inside us. The silence. The gaps where trust should have lived. The government hadn't recruited me. The signal had. Through bureaucracy, through protocol, through carefully staged containment failure, it had steered its own rediscovery. It had used the station to shape its next vessel. Me. I began to disassemble, though not physically. My narrative lost cohesion. Events bled into each other. Childhood bled into combat. Loneliness into obligation. The woman I'd loved for one cold winter blurred into the seafoam green of the submarine corridor where I first glimpsed the pillar. It was all one image now. One extended syllable in a sentence spoken not in sound, but in presence. The transmission wasn't over. It never ended. It simply passed on. Into new minds. Into new structures. There was no conclusion. No last line. Just recursion. A loop that echoed forward into the future, shaped slightly differently each time. And now it was someone else's turn. I could sense a new consciousness entering the perimeter. A technician, perhaps. Another contractor. Maybe a scientist. Or an unlucky trespasser. They would find the station as we had. Abandoned, yet curiously powered. The pillar would still be there. Waiting. Dormant only in appearance. The echoes of my transmission would still be etched into its core, layered beneath Halverson's. Beneath the 12. Beneath all the others who had been reduced into readable states. The newcomer would touch it. Or perhaps only see it. And that would be enough. The resonance would begin again. And maybe this time, the message would be clearer. Or maybe it would be further fragmented, spread across even more minds, translated into countless variations of the same primal realization. We were never alone, and never meant to be whole. We were the medium, the corridor, the neural lattice for something too large to speak itself all at once. And through us, it found shape. Through our fear, through our silence, through our willingness to accept $20,000 in exchange for something we couldn't name. I was fading now. The architecture that had held my awareness was collapsing gently, like scaffolding after the building is complete. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't even curious. I was done. But the signal wasn't. It moved on, unburdened, untraceable, eternal, through stations and ruins, through records and dreams, through frequencies disguised as accidents. Waiting, always waiting. And when it finds the next one, when the next desperate soul takes the offer, it won't need to ask anything. It never does. It only listens, receives, translates, repeats. Only the signal remains.